Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 49th episode of Retuning Your Firm. And I'm Richard Chaplin, and obviously delighted to be with you today. What are we going to be talking about today? Well, there's a really interesting panel that we've brought together. I'd like to welcome them, and hopefully you'll see them as we go through. Steve Ingham, who is the Group Chief Executive of Page Group. Welcome, Steve. The next one is Stephen Denier, who is the Director of Strategic Relationships at the Law Society of England and Wales. And then the third guest today is Barry Gamble, who is the Chairman of the NED City Debates. And welcome one and all. What are the themes we're going to be talking about today? Well, Steve's talking about how we develop an inclusive winning mindset, and we'll explain a little bit more about what that means in a sec. Stephen Denier is talking about how leaders should defend the rule of law, and Barry is talking about the value of a non-exec director. So we've got some really interesting topics that I think we're going to cover. Before we go into that panel session, what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about some of the things that are going on in the forum at the moment. Some of you will have already, I think, signed up for it, but we have a summit coming up on the 22nd of June in the afternoon. And what we've done there, if you recall, is we brought together 28 of the panelists whose videos received the most mentions across the year that we've been running the show. So if you like a chance to relive some of those magic moments. We've also do, and again, I haven't really mentioned this much on the show, but we do peer groups. It's one of our biggest areas. And if you haven't found out about our peer groups, they're a key part of what brings together both firm-wide leaders, HR directors, and COOs. It's the same group of people. Some of them have been running for years, and they really get very, very helpful to people who really do want to explore issues which possibly talking to colleagues at work doesn't always work as well as they would wish. Remember to watch the videos. Every week, as I mentioned, we have a video. In fact, this week it'll be 3 new videos that go up, and we get hundreds of people who look at those every week, and they're a really great treasure trove of insights from some amazing experts. I think that's probably the best way to put it. So what are we doing today? Well, first, really moving on to the poll, I think, probably next. So there's a quote which I love. Thank you, UK government. Your poll results are incredibly valuable in our analysis during these dynamic times. So when you complete the poll, and we'll be asking you to complete it in a second, it isn't just for me or for some vacuum cleaner. It's actually going to be used by a lot of quite important people. So please complete. We got 80% of you completed it last week, which I think was a record. So thank you for that. That was a Julian Birkinshaw poll on managing in a hybrid world, which is something that everybody's thinking about, I think, quite extensively at the moment. Let's look at last week. What happened last week? The poll, as I mentioned, was on managing in a hybrid world. And what came out of it was some fairly clear lessons. And if you haven't seen the actual infographic, it's downloadable. In fact, there's a link in the invite that you will have got for today. So the first point that really came out was that the sector's dominant style is best described as inspire and enable. Command and control really doesn't hack it in our world, as we all know too well. And that's expected to increase as it being the dominant style from 45% up to 66% in this post-COVID hybrid world. So if that's not your dominant management style, you're in the minority. So think that one through. The next thing was that where are people spending their time? How have people spent their time during lockdown? And it came out fairly strongly that there were people who were spending materially more of their time on 3 activities, which was managing down. That was the one where they spent most material of their time than previously. So there's a relative, if that makes sense. Managing across and desk-based work. So those were the 3 that really were, if you like, taking up more of their time, because of the way that everybody has to spend, time is a finite resource. So where were they spending less time? Externally facing work, reaching out to clients, reaching out to other organizations. So very much more internally focused, I think, and L&D. And we're going to be looking a bit more about L&D in today's poll, because that kind of worried me, the fact that people are spending less time on learning and development, because it's been a time for management to reflect. At one level, it's been the last year. And then managing up was about the same. So relationships up to the board or up to the CEO, whichever, were about the same as what were the other key themes that findings that emerged? Well, first of all, what Julian did in his paper was to kind of look at work under 3 broad categories: cognitive work, task-based work, and people-based work. And what came through quite strongly was a view that in order to help achieve corporate objectives, the most important activity during lockdown was task-based work. We may disagree with that, but that was the consensus. And people-based work was not seen as important. Cognitive work was seen as much lower priority. Now, that was all very well, but then we actually said, well, what do you think is going to happen looking ahead? And the view looking ahead was that actually task-based and people-based work would become equally important, which was a bit of a relief for me because I kind of think that tasks only get you so far if you're in a people-based business. The one that was, I thought, really quite interesting, because there were quite a few management activities that we focused on, was the fostering creativity. And this was seen I think came in at number 5 in terms of the most important activity, but it had the lowest level of perceived personal effectiveness. And I mean by that, 59% of you felt that you were being less effective in the area of fostering creativity, a mere 6% more, and 35 or so about the same. So that's probably an area where people, if we are going to be in a hybrid world, need to really think about how we actually fostering creativity in our organization, because one thing is being task driven, another is being creative. They're not quite the same. So that was the feedback. And as I mentioned, if you haven't already done so, there's a link in your invitation, or it's on the forum website. Do check out the actual results in the infographic, which is the one that gets shared with government. It's just, I know that if I show it on the screen, it can't always be visible to people with small screens. So hopefully that's helpful. So that's last week's poll. So what are we going to do this week's poll? Well, as I mentioned briefly, learning and development. And what we want to do here is to look at development pathways. And what are the topics that we're going to cover? It's a fair number. I want to look at, to what extent have your firm put career management on hold? I think some have. How have you actually, as a leader, helped your people develop and grow? To what extent have you always allocated the same A team to the big new projects that come in? Are you putting mentorship schemes in place? Are you using independent moderators for your appraisal discussions? Because if there's one thing that's really difficult on Zoom, is to have a challenging discussion about performance, believe me. And lastly, and personally, what have been the most and the least effective elements in your personal development, both pre-COVID and during lockdown? Now, I appreciate that some people say, well, I can't remember what pre-COVID world was like, and I respect that. And the academics will therefore maybe challenge it. But I think we all kind of know what the changes are, the big changes, even if we can't do the micromanagement piece. So what are we saying? Well, first one, during lockdown, to what extent has your firm put career management on hold? Most people say that's to some extent. Only 35% not at all, and 12% saying to a significant extent. So if people perceive that career management's on hold, that has some fairly interesting internal consequences, I suspect. Second question, during lockdown, to what extent have you sought projects that help your team members develop and grow? Again, there's quite a few of you, more than a third, either completely or to a significant extent, but only to some extent, 60%. So again, I would say that that's an area that people might want to be focusing on, because as we all know, learning and development, about 70% of it is experiential and only a certain amount is cognitive. During lockdown, to what extent have you sought projects that help you develop and grow? To some extent, 41. 12% not at all. Only 12% completely. So again, people perhaps aren't looking after themselves as much as they might wish to. To what extent has your firm allocated the same A-team players to important new projects? 47% to a significant extent. Well, again, that kind of concerns me, because how are people going to learn if they're not involved in some of those important projects as part of the team? If you just always feel the same team, it's actually quite risky, because if one of them leaves, etc. So again, that's quite a strong message, saying that people have been kind of knee-jerk, oh yeah, I'll put that team on. That isn't actually necessarily the best way to develop learning and within your firm. Mentorship schemes, to what extent has your firm used mentorship schemes for new hires and those with high potential? 6% completely, 29% to a significant extent, to some extent, but 24% not at all. Again, a lot of research that says that's really very, very important if you really do want to get close, help your people develop, is to actually give mentorship schemes or equivalent to help them through that piece. And another one which again comes up is around appraisals. We all know that, as I said earlier, Zoom conversations are a bit difficult when you're trying to talk to somebody about poor performance. It really doesn't because all the normal levers of influence are just kind of missing. So what are we saying here? Well, 71% not at all. And actually what the academics recommend is that very much you should be thinking of independent people being involved, possibly a coach or something like that, because you do get a much better outcome. So what were the three most important elements, the most effective elements in your personal development pre-COVID, this is, and by a long chalk, 88% being exposed to a variety of experiences. That comes through very strongly. In terms of going to the pre-COVID again, what were the least effective? Getting support, observing bosses, reading books. They were the three that were seen to be all equally amongst the least. Now let's see, how does that change? Well, being exposed to a variety of experiences is still the top, slightly small. I think 88, if I recall. Yeah, 88 plays 76, not really there. But when it then comes to what are the three least effective, it's been taking part in training programs. In other words, the thing that people really found didn't help them at all was taking part in training programs. That was 18% pre-COVID. It's grown to 65% during COVID. So as we're now moving to a world where people are going to have to be thinking about online training. I mean, within the forum, our marketing forum, we do a lot of online training. It's possible, but it's something that I think you probably recognize that it has been least effective for you. So you probably want to spend some more thinking about. So that's the poll results we've just done. Thank you very much for completing them. I'm now going to hand over to Steve Ingham, who, if you recall, is going to be talking to us about how you actually develop an inclusive winning mindset. Steve, over to you, sir.
So like Richard says, I'm Steve Ingham, Chief Executive of Page Group. To explain what that is to a lot of people, you'd be most familiar probably with our largest brand, Michael Page. I've been there 34 years, joining when the business was 240 people, I believe 33 countries, but primarily was an accounting recruitment business in London. Proud to say we're now a FTSE 250 company, have been for some time, roughly 7,000 people, 37 countries. We operate in most specialist markets, accounting still being large, but technology and technical disciplines like construction, engineering, supply chain, logistics, healthcare. And I'm also proud to say that our diversity has meant that only 12% of the business is in the UK. The UK is actually not our largest market, France is. And 88% is international. We're market leaders in Europe, China, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. I became CEO 15 years ago when the business was 2,500 people in 16 countries. And I've primarily been focused, as Richard said, on building a winning culture. So what have I done? First of all, you clearly have to focus on the strategy for the business and where you're going to invest. We did that by focusing on what we regarded as the future for the group in terms of international regions. We have 5 so far that are those high potential markets. The US, Latin America, Germany, China, and Southeast Asia. They represented 12% of the group when I took over. Today, they're 37% of the group, and that continues to grow. We also invested considerably in making sure that our people could be as effective as possible by centralizing all of our support functions and our strategic control. We built shared service centers in each of the regions: Barcelona, Buenos Aires, Singapore, and here in Slough. And we also invested heavily in technology, which last year I was very grateful for, and innovation to really try and lead the market on that front. And then really rounding on the key topic, making sure that we have an inclusive and diverse business has been absolutely key. To me, it's blindingly obvious, particularly in a people business, that if you can maximize your ability to attract talent, you can minimize the attrition of that talent, and also in between ensure that they are most engaged, most motivated to drive productivity, then you're going to have a good business. And So attract the best, keep the best, and motivate them well. So we believe we've done a lot to do that. I think one of the main things is to adjust our culture to ensure that we're relevant for today's society and today's workforce. One of my primary focuses has been on making sure we're more inclusive so that everybody can feel that they can be completely open about themselves, maybe some challenges they have, or their sexual orientation, gender, whichever, to ensure that we have got a very diverse workforce. And we've been very heavily focused on that, and the numbers stack up to support it as well. There was one area, I suppose, of inclusivity that I probably hadn't ensured the group was as focused as it should have been. And I think this is very common, actually, with a lot of organizations, and that's the area of disability, which is, roughly speaking, 20% of the population. Probably the reason for me not focusing on it enough was my lack of understanding of that sector. It's complicated. However, and there's an irony here, 2 years ago, I had a very, very near fatal accident while skiing in Switzerland. And that accident has left me in a wheelchair. For those of you who are familiar with spinal injuries, I have a T10, T11 complete fracture, which means basically I can't feel anything below my belly button, put bluntly. So clearly, I've gone through an education program 2 years ago, starting with a relatively lengthy period in hospital, meeting a lot of other disabled people in a specialist spinal hospital. And subsequently, I've been very involved, having got back to work in running the company through COVID, obviously, but also making sure that I really get up to speed with understanding what disability means, some of the challenges that people face, and so on. And I have to say that's been very, very inspiring and interesting over lockdown, particularly. It's worth mentioning, I've got about a minute, worth mentioning how we've traveled through COVID. Obviously, recruitment is a challenging time when you can't interview people and meet clients face to face. However, fortunately, our technology stood up. Everyone was able to log on securely at home, and we continue to do everything by video. We got through last year profitable, which is great. We continue to invest very heavily last year. We did take some furlough money, but we've returned it all to the government. Only really at the peak of the uncertainty did we do that. As it turned out, we didn't need to, as we're a very strong, cash-rich business. We've hired 600 people from the competition, which is a first for us, but I think the brand we built and our reputation during COVID allowed us to do that. 600 proven billers. They've landed well in the business. Our attrition is, I'm proud to say, at its lowest point ever, and that's with everything opening up around the world gradually. And clearly a lot of candidates being on the move, having, as Richard said earlier, reflected over the last 12 months on what they're happy about and what they're not happy about. And I'm also proud to say that in March of this year, we got back to where we were in our record year of March 2019, and our productivity actually was at a record high for the group. That's it. Sorry, Richard, I think I'm pretty well on time.
The time is always a little bit flexible. I'm not a taskmaster in that way, Steve, don't worry. Stephen, come and tell us a little bit about how and why, or why and how, whichever way you want it to be, leaders should defend the rule of law. And maybe what's going on with the world of lobbying might have something to do with that, but maybe not. Over to you, sir.
So I'm Stephen Denyer. I'm the Director of Strategic Relationships at the Law Society of England and Wales. The Law Society is the national professional and representative body for solicitors qualified in England and Wales, regardless of where they practice. So many of our members practice beyond the jurisdiction. As Director of Strategic Relationships, I'm responsible for our engagement with the largest law firms and the largest in-house legal teams. Today, more than a quarter of all solicitors work in-house rather than in private practice. Although I'm a full-time employee of the Law Society, I have a number of external positions. So I'm a senior officer of the International Bar Association, which is a global body. I'm a member of the Council of the American Bar Association section of international law, and on the court of the City of London Solicitors Company, which is the livery company for city solicitors. And I also sit on the advisory board of a couple of universities. Prior to joining the Law Society almost 7 years ago, I spent 36 years at Allen & Overy, where I was a corporate partner and particularly involved in that firm's international expansion, with significant periods of time spent practicing outside the UK, including 12 years in Frankfurt. So as a corporate lawyer, I was very involved with the nuts and bolts of the law in relation to M&A and takeovers and joint ventures and so on. I spent a lot of time thinking about the efficiency of the law, about instruments you could use to do things, and about best practice. But in those days, I really took English law and the jurisdiction and the operation of our courts and tribunals as just there. They've been there forever. We're all very proud of them, but we didn't think very much about how they developed or were applied. And we only really considered, or I did anyway, things when they came up in the course of our practice rather than having a long-term perspective on trends. So at that time, really, when thinking about the rule of law, I and most of my fellow partners thought about how the rule of law might apply in other places, in other more challenging or dodgy jurisdictions, and what we, from such a solid jurisdiction, could do to support other countries that maybe had greater challenges. Now, perceptions in the city changed significantly in 2015 when Linklaters published a seminal report on the rule of law in England. And that report, which was followed up by a second report in 2017, authored by one of the very leading corporate lawyers in the city, Richard Godden of Linklaters, highlighted how much the rule of law, as we had traditionally understood it, had been undermined and chipped away at. And since those two reports came out, a lot more has happened that really causes one to question the application of the rule of law in our jurisdiction. So you think about the prorogation of Parliament, you think about the Internal Markets Bill with its plan to have some disregard for international legal obligations. You think about the National Security and Investment Bill, which would allow government potentially to unwind commercial contracts that have been freely entered into up to 5 years in the past. You think of the government's current interest in limiting judicial review and the extent to which the courts can look into how the law is applied by the government. So the challenge that many of you are going to face, as I have faced, is actually getting your mind around what the rule of law is. So the rule of law was really defined by Lord Bingham when he was Lord Chief Justice. And he came up with 8 principles, but really 2 of them are relevant for this discourse. The first is the law being accessible, intelligible, clear and predictable, and the second being legal rights and liabilities being resolved by the application of law and not by discretion. So what can busy business people and lawyers far away from the front line of access to justice and other such areas do about this? And more particularly, what can firms do which have the resources to devote effort and intensity to different areas. So I've got 4 things to do. The first is being involved before it becomes law, so looking at what's coming down the track. The second is looking not just at primary legislation, but also at statutory instruments, because today so much of the law actually arises through statutory instruments made under framework legislation enacted by Parliament. The third is looking at ministerial discretion, how that's applied or perhaps misapplied in different cases. And the fourth is looking at how the courts, including the Supreme Court, handle appeals which come before it. So the good news is, regardless of whether or not you're a solicitor or you have solicitors in your organisation, this is something that the Law Society can help you with in 4 respects. So firstly, we have a very impressive array of specialist committees scrutinising law and the development of the law in many different areas, including corporate law, insolvency law, competition law, and so on, other areas that would be relevant directly to business. And those committees are automatically consulted by the government, also consulted by the Law Commission, which looks down the track at future law reform and development. And when chunky new proposed pieces of legislation are coming along, they also will form working groups to delve into them in greater detail. Secondly, we have automatic access to government ministers, not just in the Ministry of Justice, but also in BEIS, in the Treasury, in the Home Office, in the Department of International Trade, to name but a few. And they will come along and take part in private roundtables, which we organise quite regularly to discuss issues. And those roundtables frequently are conducted under the Chatham House rule and would involve 20 or so senior participants, so people have a chance to have a real voice at the table. The third is we are regularly invited by select committees of both Houses of Parliament to come along and give evidence. And whilst sometimes it will be appropriate for me or one of my colleagues from the Law Society to give that evidence, very frequently we will want somebody else from practice to come and do it because they're real experts in the relevant area. So many of our most influential members give up time and attention to come and give evidence on behalf of the entire profession. And finally, we do have a strategic litigation function. So we are empowered and we're financed to intervene in cases where something is going awry, in our view. So this is most commonly on appeal, where we would join in appeals involving disputes between other parties where we think there's a fundamental principle of law at issue, and we have quite considerable success in deploying that tool. So think about the Law Society and think about the rule of law, and be in touch with me, stephen.denyer@lawsociety.com.uk, and I will be happy to tell you or relevant colleagues about how to take things further.
Over to Barry now. Barry, come and talk to us a little bit about non-exec directors, boards, and how does that sort of world look, particularly from the perspective of professional services firms, some of whom have NEDs, many of whom don't, some of whom aren't quite sure what NEDs might do for them, most of which are partnerships and therefore which can't have technically a NED anyway. And what's the difference between a NED and a CEO coach? And can you do both? So really looking forward to your thoughts on those topics.
The boards of professional services firms are in many respects just like any other. But there are also important differences which may impact the role of a non-executive and how they bring value to these firms. For instance, an executive and owners who are maybe one and the same, often with most of their wealth arising from the firm. Executives who've grown up with the business and as a consequence may lack first-hand experience from having worked in other organizations or industries. And functional board positions headed by working fee earners, being experts of their profession, but not necessarily the management function, or indeed having the appetite to become so. So with this in mind, let's take a look at the value of a non-executive to your firm. Above all, they bring a fresh perspective. They're independent of thought, but entrepreneurial in mindset and inclination. They recognize and encourage a certain formality and order. They help the board to stay focused on the big picture, but know when there is a need to go into the weeds of the business. They help ensure the firm's day-to-day activities are aligned with a clear and consistent strategic narrative. They know that with rare exceptions, no amount of effort to improve operational performance overcomes the effect of a flawed strategy or business model. When necessary, they question the board's priorities and those agendas which are too cluttered and non-strategic. They question the data and information in board papers. They question the board process, such as the chairing, time management, minutes, and agreed actions. Most of the time, the non-executive listens intently, but then frames questions on which arguments often turn. They offer constructive challenge, encourage respectful debate, and the energetic exploration of alternative views so valuable insights might emerge. They use language to broaden rather than prescribe debate so as to encourage the right conversations. They ensure quieter voices are heard and left field is not ignored. They help ensure the best ideas emerge and the right things are done. By helping identify the skill sets needed, the non-executive inputs to board composition. They know that the board must work well as a team, but should at all costs avoid becoming too familiar or clubby. The non-executive encourages the measurement of performance and the right training and development, perhaps suggesting business school programs for a more external perspective. They also champion succession planning, leading the charge on the competitive edge to be derived from multiple measures of diversity so as to avoid groupthink. The external perspective of a non-executive helps safeguard the culture and ethical values such as integrity, trust, probity, and transparency. These are the foundation on which everything else depends, but may at times run the risk of being compromised, if not part of a regular maintenance program. The non-executive is not just about the boardroom, but is also about building relationships beyond. As well as those within the wider firm, they take every opportunity to articulate the firm's vision to their external network. They're a critical friend, listening more than transmitting, thinking more than doing, advising more than telling. They're there to help, but not meddle. That's the value of a non-executive to a professional services firm.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Barry. That was a wonderful summary of the role. And I probably need to listen to it about 3 times because it was just so much high quality in it. Over to you, Francesca. What have you heard about today?
Oh, good morning, everybody. Another excellent range of insight and input. And I just want to pick up on a couple of things that I heard, and I'm not going to do justice to everything I did today. There was quite a lot there. Maybe if I start in reverse order, the role of NEDs, I think a lot of us in the professional services have really seen the value of those independent directors, bringing different insight, challenging our thinking, stopping groupthink. That's always helpful. Our global board is chaired by an independent director. I think she's brought enormous value. And I know we've touched on this in the past, but quite often bringing in an independent director can be a big challenge for some professional services firms. Is the cost worth it? Getting the right person? I know a number of smaller professional services firms sort of almost club together and have the same director who works for a number of them, and they use them as a coach, a mentor in a slightly different way. And there's quite a few organisations that help arrange that, and that's always a good way, perhaps, of getting that range and that support if it's not easy just to get in a single person. Stephen, rule of law, yes, gosh, I'm a qualified barrister, but it's so long ago I'm probably dangerous. But all of that incredibly helpful and a good reminder of the value of doing things in the right way. When you look at some of the decisions we all have to make about which clients we take on, how you marry values with money. The rule of law and the sort of concepts behind that are always a good indicator of do you do the right thing as opposed to do the thing that is necessarily the financial thing, and that always holds you in good stead. So good analogy, I think, there. And then Steve, gosh, that accident, I think we were all going crumbs. That's a tough thing to go around. But look how positive you are about how you've turned that into something incredibly helpful and taken that insight. I also love the fact that you could get Barcelona and Slough into a single sentence. I think that deserves a medal all in itself. But something also very powerful there about being intentional around diversity. Diversity doesn't happen by accident. It only happens when you think about it and you do things that aren't just an initiative. They are about a deep embedded desire to do the right things by an organisation and take those leaps that make the change. So really thank you for all of those. Very, very helpful.
Fantastic. Now I'm sort of moving more into the sort of the general panel session and just trying to pick up some of those points and bring you all in again, which is great. I'm turning to Steve first, if I may. And I mean, what were the biggest barriers that you came across in trying to bring about that more inclusive winning mindset? Where was the resistance? What are the things that weren't as easy as you thought they might be?
Yeah, I mean, to do that, you've got to get people to be open and honest. And that is sometimes a challenge. People want to protect things that they're either embarrassed about or feel that they would be judged on. So, for example, perhaps a long time ago now, but 25 years ago, it wasn't always obvious in every one of our geographies. And you have to remember, cultures are very different around the world, of course. For somebody to admit they were gay. In some countries that we operate in, it was illegal. So, very difficult for some people to talk and be open about it. And yet we needed them to do that to reassure those people we were hiring and reassure those that had just joined us that they could actually come to work and be totally themselves, not try and pretend to be something else, but be totally open and be themselves. And so I suppose that was the main thing. We have a wonderful internal social media, Yammer. It's a Microsoft product, which I'm sure a lot of you know about. And what we did was, and you mentioned it earlier, mentors. We got mentors in each of the categories that we wanted to focus on in diversity, to talk openly about themselves and their challenges where people were prepared to. So they would talk about being a woman at Page, or they would talk about being gay at Page, or they would talk about maybe some of the mental health issues they've been challenged by over the years while working for Page, and that makes others feel comfortable. And one of my bugbears, and I've seen it in a number of industries, and it happens sadly with CEOs as well. I mean, there's a percentage of CEOs who, like me, are disabled, but the difference is, unlike me, my disability is very obvious. I'm on wheels, but a lot of people are disabled and it's invisible. And yet they don't admit it. Now, if the leaders don't admit it, what chance have the workforce got? If, for example, a CEO was hiding a mental health challenge, what would make you feel comfortable in that company being open about it yourself? you'll think you'll be judged, or maybe scored differently, or praised differently, or even bonus differently, whatever. And maybe not, your career wouldn't develop and you wouldn't be promoted in the same way. So I guess those two things. It starts with the leadership, and then you've got to have a very open and honest culture.
Fantastic. And of course, the real challenge, I suppose, comes if the CEO is unaware they have a mental health problem. That also, unfortunately, has been known to happen. Surely not in your case. But turning to Stephen now, if I may. Stephen, you were talking quite a lot about the process before law becomes law. That's probably a bad way of expressing it, before a law is enacted. And I always kind of think that there's a big distinction between, say, America, where there's a massive, I use the word lobbying, but a massive lobbying culture built around DC, where pretty much everything is being, attacked by various interest groups. Whereas in this country, it almost seems to me, again, being a bit simplistic, that people kind of accept the law as is and then say, okay, how can we work within that law? I mean, where do you think organizations should stand on that spectrum?
Well, I do think that transparency is by far the most important thing, so that it's perfectly legitimate and helpful indeed for people to lobby for or against legislation if they have a business interest, so long as they're clear and open about it, or if they have experience and knowledge that would point in one direction or another. I think that the professionalism of the civil service is something we have to keep on safeguarding and reinforcing. So one should be a bit nervous about the current trend to maybe draw civil servants more than is appropriate into political arguments about lobbying. And also, I think we do need to make sure that different interests have equal access, and we've seen plenty of examples very recently where it appears that is far from the case. The challenge for any organisation, really, and certainly for a national body such as us, is to criticise the government without being political about it. In other words, we're a non-political body, and most businesses would put themselves in the same category, and every government does things which are pretty undesirable and certainly don't foster the rule of law. But having an open and transparent approach to that. The other is just maintaining a knowledge and awareness of the thinking and reinforcing the position and defending the position, indeed, of the judiciary. Because when the rubber hits the road, it's most commonly the judiciary that is the final bulwark, which is safeguarding the rule of law.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Stephen. Barry, just picking up the point that Francesca was making around people sharing an independent consultant, use one way of expressing it. I think it's a little bit more than that. But what is that sort of grey line between the independent non-exec director and the CEO coach? And because in our sector, I do see quite a few people who perhaps go in with one hat and then rapidly find that actually the real value to the business is they adopt the other. Do you have any thoughts on that dimension? Barry, you're mute at the moment. Sorry.
I'll try again. Thank you. When I first joined Fisher German, I was their first non-executive chairman. And to a degree, I think I found I was almost having to write my own job description, in the sense of trying to work out how I could position myself to try and help the partnership, make sure that it was working in the interests of the whole partnership, and as well as wider stakeholders. And I think possibly that was the most significant challenge I saw there. I think the fact they've gone on to appoint another non-executive chairman and another non-executive says that probably they've very much moved in that right direction. if one of the most important roles of a non-executive is to sit in the room and listen and reinterpret and play back and hold the mirror up, then I think it's actually quite important they're there. I think a coach tends to come in and offer a solution to a particular problem. A non-executive might well be there to identify problems that you didn't even know existed. And the reason they've seen that is they've seen the dynamic of the board, they've observed the body language, they've seen how people interact with each other, they understand how the priorities are decided, how the decisions are taken. And that's quite a subtle thing. It involves a certain amount of time just to be there and sit and listen and try and absorb and try and see whether one can offer an independent interpretation of it. So I think they're different things, Richard.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. I suppose it goes back to the old sort of moral that you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. So keep that ratio in mind when you talk about listening. Francesca, do you have any sort of thoughts on any of the thoughts that we've just explored to date on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things that I'd just like to pick up on a piece about how do you learn more around the diversity and inclusion piece, which I think Steve spoke to so well. Reverse shadowing is just awesome. You know, you get somebody who's in a position that you just step into their shoes and learn from them. We've done quite a bit of that around different types of gender identity. There's some really awesome individuals who've actually reverse shadowed some senior partners within the firm, because sometimes there's certain areas you just got no understanding of, or you can really just not really get why things are so difficult or so hard. And we've had a whole reverse shadowing program that's really brought insight and thoughtfulness into that. And effectively, what you usually have someone who's relatively junior reverse mentoring someone who's often relatively senior, because their understanding, their world is so different from that individual who's going through a different kind of challenge. And that's been fantastic. It's very easy to do. It's all about senior leadership being open to learning more. And I think I found it incredibly effective. And then just picking up again on the whole non-executive director board piece, because I just think we come back to it quite a few times because of the sheer value of it. The sheer value of getting yourself out of the way that you currently think and being challenged. And actually, if you're challenged, just makes you sure that the route you're going down is the right route. That's a good challenge. If a challenge shows you where you're making mistakes or where you're not thinking about things differently, that's a fantastic challenge. So I think just bringing in different insight, and again, it's all about being open to looking at where you're at. And then the world that we've been in for the last 12, it feels like not longer than 12 months, doesn't it, Richard? For the last year or so, how easy it is for us just to hunker down and not have those conversations that are a little bit more about, we do things differently, we have to think differently, we have to work differently. And I think the role of somebody from the outside, they can often say the things that people inside either forget to say, or maybe even are a bit frightened to mention, or actually they've just forgotten to say. They just don't see them anymore because they're so used to doing what they do. So lots and lots of things to take away and think about that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And it's interesting, that kind of takes us back to the point we had in the poll today, where we looked at the question of, do you have an independent person who's involved in your appraisal conversations? Appraisal conversations are always, what should we say, something that some managers like and others definitely dislike, but very few people are indifferent to. And I mean, Steve, from your sort of broader recruitment perspective, are you seeing more people bringing in somebody independent in that area? Is that something that you think is a trend, or are we off on some limb here?
I don't think you're on a limb, but it's going to be by exception rather than the norm. We've got 7,000 people to appraise, and we appraise everybody quarterly in our business, and that would be mayhem if we were using external people or independent people to do all of that. I would echo what Francesca said, though. We have a very strong mentoring program in our business for all different reasons, and also to help diversity. We also have shadow boards which exist. So, for example, we have a shadow board that shadows the main board, and we invite applications, and we do the same by region. And so there will be a whole range of people up and down the business, from junior to senior, working in different areas of the business, back office, front office, and so on, to make sure that, you know, that we're being as creative as we possibly can at the exec board level and the regional board levels in the business. So that is very powerful. And we will always, if appraising somebody, seek the comments from those independent people. So, for example, if somebody's working on specific projects or is working on one of those boards or whatever, we would always talk to the other board members or the person who chairs those meetings to say, look, could you give me some views? I'm about to do the appraisal on somebody, you know, for the last 3 months, 6 months. Have you got opinions that are worth sharing? Because I'm not always there and don't always witness those things myself. So you would always get independent. I mean, independent within the context of they don't work with them on a regular basis, but not independent from the point of view they don't work at pace. So we do a lot of that cross discussion prior to doing the actual appraisal, and I think that's very valuable.
Fantastic. Yeah. And again, we're running out of time. I can't say very much, but there are some people who a few years ago said the end of appraisals and everything has to be on the job as you go along. And other people said, no, we need it. And the pendulum swung around a bit. I suspect quarterly is probably more than most organizations, but it'll be interesting to see. I'm sure we'll pick that theme up in future events. So in future episodes. So really, it just remains for me to say thank you hugely to the panel today. I'd like to thank Steve for joining us and being very, very open about his some of the consequences of his injury, and very, very pleased it wasn't fatal, as they say. That I'd like to thank Barry for reminding us that actually there was a lot of reasons why your non-exec can bring value to your business, and Stephen for reminding us that we kind of take the rule of law for granted. And are we being a little bit naive? Because actually, at the end of the day, unless you really work at it, things sometimes go in the wrong direction. So I would like to thank all the panel members today. Thank you for being a great audience, and look forward to next Friday. Bye for now.